Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into an idea that really challenges the bedrock of a nation, its constitution.
And that brings us to the core question here. Should a constitution be set in stone forever, or does every generation get a shot at rewriting the rules? This explainer digs into a book that tackles that very question, but for the world's largest democracy.
All right, so we are unpacking Dr. Ryan Baidya's book, Decolonize India. And let me tell you, it makes a pretty bold, pretty provocative argument that India needs to scrap its constitution and start over.
So, let's get right into it. The author's whole case starts with what he calls the colonial inheritance. Basically, his central claim is all about where India's current constitution really comes from.
Now, according to the book, if you look at this timeline, you see that there wasn't really a clean break from the past. It wasn't a revolution in lawmaking. Instead, it looks more like an evolution of British-era laws, a legal framework that was inherited, not invented from scratch. And here's the core of that argument. The author claims that the Government of India Act of 1935, a law written by the British, wasn't just some casual influence. No, he says it was the actual blueprint. The argument is that this colonial framework was basically copied and pasted right into independent India. The book then tries to put some numbers on this. I mean, look at this chart. It estimates that over 90% of the Constitution is based on foreign models, mostly British. And then only a tiny sliver, about 5%, is actually rooted in India's own ancient traditions. So what's the author's conclusion from all this? Well, as this quote from the book puts it, the Constitution was fundamentally the work of a British-trained elite. And because of that, in his view, India's decolonization was never truly complete. Okay, so if that's the foundation, what are the alleged consequences? The book argues that this has led to some major fault lines in the system today. First up is a critique of secularism. The author points out that you have different personal laws for different religions, and that the state controls Hindu temples in a way it doesn't for the institutions of other faiths. The argument here is, how can the state be truly neutral if it's treating religious groups differently? Next, the book questions the term socialist. The Constitution's preamble says India is a socialist country, but the author contrasts that with the reality on the ground, a massive and growing wealth gap. He argues that in practice, India is much closer to a capitalist-leaning mixed economy. And finally, the book turns its critique to democracy itself. The argument is that the first-past-the-post electoral system, along with things like political dynasties and deep-rooted corruption, all work to undermine the actual spirit of a true democracy.
Now, to really drive home this idea of an incomplete break from the colonial past, the author makes a seriously provocative proposal. He says India should change its Independence Day. He contrasts August 15, 1947, which he calls a compromise that left India as a dominion with the British king as head of state, with a different date, back in 1943, which he argues was the real moment of true sovereignty declared on Indian soil. So, if that's the diagnosis, what's the prescription? Well, the book doesn't just call for a few amendments here and there. Nope, it calls for something far more radical, a completely new constitution for a reimagined Bharat.
This vision for a new constitution is built on four really big ideas. First, it should be based on indigenous philosophies like Dharma. Second, it needs to be short and simple so any citizen can understand it. Third, it has to be crystal clear that the people are the masters and the state is the servant, not the other way around. And then there's the fourth idea, which is maybe the most radical of all. The entire Constitution should be rewritten every 20 years.
And to make politics more accountable, the book lays out some major electoral reforms. Things like requiring candidates to win more than 50% of all registered voters, not just those who show up. Giving citizens the power to recall elected officials they're not happy with. And having direct elections for top jobs, like the Prime Minister.
And to fight corruption, the author puts forward this pretty unique concept he calls the police of police, or POP. Just think about that. It would be a totally independent body with its own judicial power, kind of like a court-martial, to go after corrupt officials, ministers, and even the police themselves. This all brings us to the final, really big-picture idea at the heart of this whole argument. And honestly, it's a question that applies way beyond just India.
You know, you might think the idea of a total constitutional rewrite sounds crazy,
But from this book's perspective, it's not as unheard of as you'd think. The author puts it in a global context, pointing out that countries like France, South Africa, and even Chile more recently have all done it to meet the needs of a new era.
And really, it all boils down to this quote from Thomas Jefferson that's central to the book's entire argument. The earth belongs to the living and not to the dead. That really makes you think, doesn't it? Should any generation really have the power to lock all future generations into their laws forever?
And that leaves us with this final thought to chew on. You know, whether you agree with the book's provocative conclusions or not, it forces us all to ask some really deep questions. Questions about national identity, about the long shadow of colonialism, and about the very nature of government in a world that, let's face it, never, ever stops changing.